I'm good. Welcome, everybody, to Justin Edgar's Reasonable Adjustment. It's International Day of Disabled People. It's the 25th anniversary, almost exactly, of the Disability Discrimination Act. So it is the perfect day to be discussing Justin Edgar's Reasonable Adjustment exhibition. But first, some introductions. I'm Ju Gosling. I'm Artistic Director of Together 2012. I also lead on the Disability Film Festival. So, this event is taking place both as part of the overall festival, because the Reasonable Adjustment exhibition is part of the overall festival. But this event is also taking place as part of the Together 2020 Disability Film Festival, which began today and runs till Sunday. There's a great deal more online about the programme and also about the festival events next week. So do look at that. It's all on www.together2012.org.uk. So, just a little bit of audio description and some information about the access. I have short, tenured red hair in a self styled corona crop, really under control only through the use of Brill cream. I have black plastic glasses, black wrist braces, silver coloured jewellery, and in honour of the occasion, I have a black t shirt with pink writing that says proud, angry, and strong. And that was a Direct Action Network campaign t shirt from about 20 years ago. Anybody who sees us regularly on Together Unlocked will know that if this is ironed, which it is, it means I haven't worn it since March, owing to the absence of social care support. We have no ironing. So it's particularly nice to be wearing such a historic t shirt and also an ironed t shirt. We have our British Sign Language interpreter, Chris Burrows. The best way to see Chris is if you have gallery view. Unfortunately, if you're watching this on a, a tablet or a mobile, sorry, I wanted to say a mablet, but that really doesn't exist at all. So if you're watching on some devices, Zoom will not display the British Sign Language. However, we will have the recording of this up. We do have live captions, and to access the live captions, you need to go to the CC at the bottom right hand corner of your screen. That will work on YouTube and also on Zoom. If you'd like to ask questions, you can use the YouTube live chat, you can use the Zoom live chat, and there are also, for people on the Zoom, a special question and answer box, which is on the bottom right hand corner, conveniently next to the closed caption box. So I'm finally going to let Justin get a word in. And what I was going to ask Justin is if you could just give us a little bit of audio description and a little bit of introduction to your career to date. I know it's very lengthy, so try
Okay, yeah, I'll try. So I'm Justin Edgar. I'm a 49-year-old man. I've got shoulder length, curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a check t-shirt. I too have suffered from the COVID cuts. Haven't had a haircut in a while, so it's probably a bit longer than it normally is. I'm in my home office, and I've got a slight beard going on as well. Maybe that's due to COVID as well. So where do I start with? I mean, this is my first visual arts exhibition. It came out of a commission for Unlimited, the Disability Arts Strand. And I suppose I've come to art kind of late in life, but I've always done my art as well as doing other stuff. And my main career has been as a film and television maker, but also running community projects with disabled people and running 104 Films, which is a training and production company focusing on disability. And we've done many films, been involved with all sorts of things, from Notes on Blindness to Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, Unrest, which was a film by a woman with ME. So all kinds of interesting work we've done in that area. So why do you ask yourself, if you've been reasonably successful as a filmmaker, why turn to art, which is a tortuous environment for anybody. And really, it was because I couldn't figure out a way to tell the story of reasonable adjustment in a film. I thought, I can't do this. It just doesn't work. And I tried to come up with a structure for a film. Would it be a fake documentary? Would it be a narrative, about one of the people involved in this movement? How would it work? And the only way I could kind of figure out to make it work was to do it as a visual arts exhibition. That sort of clicked, and it made sense to me. And I'd been aware of Unlimited for some time, and put in a few projects with them before. Because like I said, I've always done art. My degree was in art. I've got a first class degree in art, whatever that's worth. I don't know, probably nothing. But I'm an art graduate, an art student, and I like to think I'm fairly well versed in art. So it sort of made sense. It's kind of sideways steps, and certainly you've got a lot of artists who make films. Sam Taylor Wood, Steve McQueen, Tracy Emin. It's a common crossover, isn't it?
Yeah, they're all at it.
They are. They're on our turf as filmmakers and encroaching. And I'm sure many artists probably feel that about me coming in to do an art exhibition. And what does he know about it? So that was the inspiration for doing Reasonable Adjustment. Really, it was the right medium. The medium fitted, and I was quite happy to never do another art exhibition again. But I've had another idea, which I don't know. Perhaps we'll talk about that later on, which might well happen later next year. But we'll see.
So tell me first, or explain to people who haven't already been round it, what the exhibition consists of at the moment, and also how it was presented earlier in the year at the Art House.
Yeah, so initially the exhibition opened, I say opened, I suppose is the right word for it, at a gallery called the Art House, which is a contemporary art gallery in Wakefield, Yorkshire, and opened there at the end of January and had a pretty decent run there, and the exhibit's based on a disability rights movement called Reasonable Adjustment, and they range from a burnt out wheelchair that one of the protesters had actually died in while dropping a lit Molotov cocktail on themselves, to a old television camera that's been shot by a visually impaired activist who raided BBC studios in Birmingham, Pebble Mill, during a live broadcast of Pebble Mill at 1. There are microfiche newspaper articles relating to reasonable adjustment. There are a range of photographs, protest posters, and various other fanzines, pamphlets, things like this, which were displayed in the exhibition. So then it transferred to the Attenborough Art Centre in Leicester, and was there for about a week, and then COVID hit, and the world turns upside down, and we didn't really know what to do with it. Nobody knew how long this was going to last or how long it was going to go on. So the exhibition is still there. It's been taken down now, but it's and replaced by another exhibition, but it's still there, and it's being stored and waiting for the next physical manifestation. So in the interim period, I went to the Arts Council and said, can we put this exhibition online? Because when it was at the Art House in Wakefield, we'd filmed a lot of the exhibition with a Steadicam. We'd been around, filmed it professionally, properly, and we had all sorts of material, and felt like it could be a kind of agitprop fanzine style website with a sort of punky kind of feel to it. And that was kind of the pitch, and that's what we did. We spent the last kind of 6 months, taking a hell of a long time. It's been a lot of work, putting the exhibition online and making it as accessible as we possibly can. And we have 7 different accessible versions of the virtual tour film, and that brings us up to here. So this is kind of first proper airing we've had of it in public. It's been at Together 2012.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a fantastic exhibition to premiere. One of the things, before we move on, I just wanted to pick up that I thought was an interesting technique We always try, well, certainly in my own practice, I always try and do an online version of my exhibitions, and I have done right since the 90s. But what I find really interesting about the four exhibitions that we have this year is two of them are based on virtual galleries. You know, they're real exhibitions like yours, they're real exhibitions that have been in real places. But they've found this software, you effectively design your own gallery and you put the images in as digital, and you can kind of navigate around almost like you're in Google Street View. What you've done is another variant, you know, yeah, a completely different variation of that, which I also think is really interesting. Where, like you say, you filmed it, and you filmed it probably in a way that most of us wouldn't have the skills or the resources to do. But then you're not having to sort of decide everything that you do in the way that you do the virtual gallery, but you have these guided tours, and you can choose the access for the guided tour, which, yeah, I mean, seven different versions is at least four more versions than most people ever produce.
Yeah, yeah, and we actually, some of them are done in interesting ways. I think, for example, we use this thing called talk text, which is an automated form of audio description on the virtual tour, which is used in the documentary. That's also on the website. So yeah, it was a challenge doing that, really. And you know, it's a bit of a frontier still, access. A lot of people are not creating very accessible stuff, and I think it really needs to be pushed, and that needs to be challenged, the concept of what is access and how, how much access do we need. And it seems to be the age-old kind of interesting. I think I was talking to Tom Ferber, who might be watching us, but about this. If you don't have a BSL interpreter, then people who are deaf definitely won't come. But then if there's nobody who is a BSL user deaf in the audience, do you need the BSL interpreter? And of course, you have the BSL interpreter there, because then otherwise deaf people might not come at all. It has to be accessible, otherwise you shouldn't do it. You know, and that was strongly how I felt about this. You know, that the fact that even if no people with learning disabilities look at this website, we were making a statement that there is a version for people with learning disabilities with widget viz caps. There is a version for people with mental health issues such as anxiety, depression. There is a version for people with low contrast sensitivity in their vision. It's important to do this stuff because and to push the boundaries a little bit. Otherwise, most people will not engage with it. So you're creating a shop window where people come in because they see that it's for them, and that it's sympathetic to their needs.
Well, absolutely. And I think we were so proud not just to premiere the digital version, but the level of access. And again, I think that makes it incredibly relevant on International Day of Disabled People. I mean, you talk about the exhibition in real life being at the Unlimited Festival, but all I have is a collection of emails from the South Bank Centre saying, oh, yes, you appear to have complained every year since 2012 that you couldn't access the South Bank Centre because we don't provide blue badge parking for wheelchair accessible vehicles. And then you have Unlimited say, well, access starts at the door, but of course it doesn't. And of course it doesn't. And yes, I think the digital access for us, the challenges have really been around visual impairment, and particularly with the film festival. Film festival regulars know that I personally provide quite a lot of the live audio description on demand. We could theoretically do that through Zoom, but the image would be so small and grainy already that it actually wouldn't make sense. There's a huge difference between being in right at the front of a very big screen and having some audio description and having somebody kind of mumbling in compressed audio over a film that you can already barely see. So in a way, I think what we found is, although we embed audio description into things like the live stream, that it's actually for the film festival, certainly for screening films, if there isn't a version with audio description built in, I think that is where it becomes really problematic. And if we have time later, because of your work with 104 Films, I'd love to talk to you a bit more about accessibility to films, because again, I know that if I'm going to get films from 104, it's going to be accessible, but very often it doesn't even seem to be a funding thing. I mean, I find it embarrassing, the films that I get entered, which have been fully funded by the Arts Council, and yet nobody has said to them it has to have captions. If it's funded by the British Film Institute, you can guarantee it doesn't have captions, because, again, it's not part of their funding criteria. And with limited budgets, unless they say you have to spend whatever percentage on access, it just isn't spent. But what I'd really like to come on to talk about now is when you talk about a fake documentary, how did the idea of reasonable adjustment really come about?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's important to point out, is that, I talk about reasonable adjustment as though they're real, but they're not real. Of course, it's a fictional disability rights movement, and we created it. And I suppose the rationale behind creating it was we've lived through, and this is especially pertinent, because of what's happened in the last 8 months. But disabled people have lived through one of the worst times in my living memory. And according to the British Medical Journey, 130,000 people with disabilities have died as a result of austerity introduced by the government of Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. So I feel like how far do you have to be provoked? I mean, these are genocidal numbers, depending on who you believe and what you read. The Nazis killed 400,000 people in the Action T4 program, euthanasia program. So what is the extreme of behavior? How far do you have to be provoked and pushed, and what is justified? So people come into the exhibition, and some people think they're real, and they see some of the language. Some of the language is quite shocking, but you have to remember that Reasonable Adjustment purportedly were carrying out their actions at a time when we still had the Spastic Society, was called the Spastic Society, and words such as that were I'm not going to use them now, but really derogatory words about disabled people were in common usage, and they feature in the exhibition. That's really, really shocking stuff. And I think people, by and large, when I watched them and observed them watching the documentary, they thought it was justified in some respects. They thought that Reasonable Adjustment had an argument to take up arms and be violent. And I think that's a question we've got to ask ourselves now. I mean, look at the death figures from COVID. 1/3 of those deaths come from the disabled community. The scandals of residential homes for people with learning disabilities, for instance, where COVID has spread like wildfire, because we haven't provided proper provision in those places. It's really shocking. So it is a fight, there is a fight for rights still going on. And much as I respect and loved, those disability rights protests, and in a small way was part of them, as an undergraduate student back in the 90s, and certainly have met characters like Matt Fraser, Barbara Ziki, Jane Campbell, since, worked with some of them, Liz Carr and people like that. And what they did was astonishing and amazing, and in the spirit of punk. But I found myself daydreaming about what would have happened if they'd gone further, and what would that have resulted in? We know the DDA 25 years on, we know its shortcomings. And we know how something like austerity could happen despite the DDA, and the fact that millions of people's lives have been made miserable because of it, and people have died. So that was my rationale behind making it up. I hope that kind of makes sense, but I'm very open to engaging in debate and comment, because I'm aware that it's annoyed some people as well, some of the people who are original, exponents of the disability rights movement. Why are you making it up? Because it's the real. But that wasn't kind of the point. It wasn't to deride or undermine the effect. It was to kind of answer a question, to posit a question about what happens when you push to extremes.
Yes, and I think that's so interesting. I mean, our chair, Julie Newman, is in the audience, and she's also my partner. But I first met Julie at work in the late 90s, either 98 or 99, because I was working part time for Greater London Action on Disability, and they produced the only disabled women's newsletter, full stop, which I was freelancing for. And they said, "Oh, go down to Lambeth Centre for Independent Living. You know, they're in occupation." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And it turned out, to cut a long story short, the council had a policy of closing down voluntary sector organisations locally because they also, still are 20 years later, were doing huge regeneration projects, and they saw community organisations as standing in the way of planners. And of course, with Grenfell, we now know how important it is, but it was a very deliberate policy. And once the staff had been made redundant because they took the grant funding away, the trustees moved in with a lot of the members. They took over the centre, they occupied it for 4 months. They had an international coalition of support, protesters brought the traffic to a halt in the centre of Lambeth, and so on and so forth. But eventually they had to withdraw, because not because of the harassment, because they'd had their benefits stopped and their social care support taken away very early on, and people just kept bringing food and everybody looked after each other, but because of the threat of violence. And I think, we've seen, I think in the last 10 years, when we've seen the police pulling wheelchair users out of their wheelchairs in protests and so on, you sort of know that whether it was the late 90s or now, in a way, we're limited in what we can do by our own physical vulnerability, that sense that we are genuinely, more vulnerable to police action. But I also wonder, I mean, I know Julie could say much more, and she's probably typing away at the moment. But one of the ways they kept cheerful was they sang songs from musicals, and particularly Oliver. And they always said afterwards they would love to have made a musical play about the occupation, because it was the longest running, kind of most full on occupation. But there's no interest, no funding, and also these things are very, very difficult to do. So, one of the things I wanted to explore this evening is whether it's actually easier in all sorts of ways to create, I don't like to call it fake, but it is in this sense genuinely fake news, than it is to report the real thing. Yes, there's a few high profile musicians and so on, but in a way, coming from the Labour movement, I was chairing the NUJ's Equality Council in the 80s and 90s. The kind of, let's get a guitar out and sing a protest song, or do a little something at the telethon, actually still seemed to me, even in the standards of those days, to be very soft and very straightforward. And I notice in 25 years of the DDA, the Lambeth occupation is still not of interest to anybody. It's much more interesting. But I just think it's much safer to say, oh, look, here's a protest singer. But you obviously found all of that far too safe. You said you couldn't think of another way to do the project, but what was the starting point? Was it that sense of people being pushed? Because actually, one more thing that really occurred to me when you were talking, back in January for Holocaust Memorial Day, and it seems like a different year, but Julie and I bizarrely were invited to City Hall and joined a whole bunch of dignitaries, and we couldn't work out whether it was because we were the only gay people, the only disabled people, quite why we were there. Um, we had appalling access and got very cold and very unwell, but we did have a good relationship as a result of the complaints with the Holocaust Memorial Trust. And before COVID, so in February, we were talking about, well, how do we get across the reality of 500,000 people dying in the Holocaust? Why is it so much easier to get across the reality of almost anybody else dying than disabled people? You have memorials to the Roma, quite rightly, to the LGBTQI plus community and, of course, to the Jewish community. And yet there just wasn't this concern. And at that point, we were all saying, well, I think somehow these people aren't real. They didn't survive, or they went back into institutions. They haven't been able to bear witness in the way that other communities have done. And then COVID struck. And then here we have people with learning difficulties of working age, 6 times as likely to die. Those of us receiving care in the community, just as likely to die of COVID as if we're in a care home. And still nobody cares. And it's sort of, you go back to, oh, well, actually, we're going to have to sit down with the Holocaust Memorial Trust again, because it's like there is a Holocaust. And still, oh, they had underlying health conditions. And it's just like every single report, either, don't worry, they had underlying health conditions, or, oh, they didn't. But don't worry, mostly it happens to disabled people, as if somehow we're still second rate. I mean, do you feel it's actually an a good time for reasonable adjustment? Is it time we should be sort of thinking, why do we just sit there and take it?
I mean, interestingly, I was shooting a film during the bird flu epidemic with Catherine Araniello, the late Catherine Araniello, and he used to eternally piss her off how people were saying, "Oh, people with underlying health conditions," and the editor of the film had to ended up editing remotely with Catherine because we had to self-isolate. This was like 10 years ago, wasn't it? Bird flu 2010, something like that. So yeah, it's kind of, I think in general, when it comes to disability rights, there is a symbolic annihilation of the disability rights movement by the powers that be, by the rest of society. People are not interested in it, and in a way that they should be, and they should be made to be. And that's probably, maybe there's a little bit of anger behind reasonable adjustment as well. Because it really does, whatever people see it, it provokes a reaction. And interestingly, some of the moments, because some of the things on the website are real. It has an embedded link from YouTube, which is a protest by DPAC being shut down in 2016, and the reporter for the BBC is approached by an usher from the House of Commons and says, "You have to stop filming." And he says, "I'm going to have to terminate this broadcast." And everybody said, "Oh, that was good. How did you do that? Was it green screen with the House of Commons?" He said, "No, it's real. This is absolutely, completely real." And that sadly is the truth. That truth is strange. There's also footage of the Bolivian disability rights protests from 2018 on there, where they're hosing people down with water cannons, being knocked out of their wheelchairs in water cannons, etc. So yeah, there's a lot of oppression there, and oppressed people have a history of fighting back. So it's a fantasy to imagine that, but I don't think it's a fantasy which perhaps could be maybe not that far from the truth. We've had huge movements, haven't we, in the last 2 years? We've had BLM has just been taking over the world this year, which has been astonishing to watch. And prior to that, we had and still ongoing is Extinction Rebellion. So people are looking for something. People are looking to right these injustices. And I mean, part of doing reasonable adjustment, I have a forum section on the website where people can engage with it and write comments, whether hate it, like it, whatever, want to find out more about reasonable adjustment. And part of it is kind of creating a movement. I hope that nobody goes out and shoots up Pebble Mill. Well, it doesn't exist anymore, Pebble Mill. It's now a car park, flats. But I wouldn't want anybody to do that. But I kind of find it interesting if people do take to doing sort of cheeky disability rights activism. I think that would be a really positive outcome for the project. It shows that people have engaged with it.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways that we can campaign that are creative. I mean, I think one of the reasons I like it is a bit cheeky, but also I get so sick of invites to things that they go, "Oh, we're going to protest outside the House of Commons," and I think, well, I'd love to do that, but if I can't even get a PA to take me to the dentist, who's going to take me to Westminster? And if I get to Westminster, there's no parking. So that kind of sense of being able to take part in traditional protests or traditional marches, I mean, I think there's so much to unpick, which we won't get round to tonight, which is why, yeah, why it's almost ingrained in us that we don't deserve more. Because I think there's often a difference between people I meet who've lived a life as a non disabled person and people who haven't. And then
Mm.
they just say, well, I expect to be treated exactly the same as I was before. And you think, absolutely right.
Mm.
And I always think I am demanding the right to be treated like everybody else. And then I realize that on occasion, I think because there is so much bad treatment, there is a level where you're not noticing it because you've always lived life like that. Tell us a bit more with the website. How did you create, for example, the the documentary about yourself? Because there's a wonderful piece at the beginning about how you as a student were following the movement round, and then you're talking about the symbol. How did you come up with the symbol? And is that something we could start? The idea for anybody who hasn't seen the exhibition yet is this symbol started appearing and people were using it even if they didn't know what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, say it was a ridiculous, foolhardy undertaking to do this, because and a lot of people just think it's real anyway. But we went to great lengths to make it seem real, and why would you think it's not real? I suppose if you're not a study of disability history and you don't know a bit about disability rights movement, you just, oh yeah, maybe I remember that. So the starting point, I suppose, was, you look at the time, this is pre-internet, which is an advantage. It's sort of late 80s, early 90s. And you look at things like the Animal Liberation Front. I wasn't involved myself, but I had a lot of friends who were involved in the animal rights struggle, who did all sorts of things, hunt sabbing and things like that. And nobody I knew did this, but for example, I read a news story about them branding somebody. They got some cattle farm or something who'd been cruel to the animals, and they branded him with a branded eye, and they sent fire bombs, letter bombs in the post, things like, they're quite active kind of terrorist organization, really. And I grew up as well with the spectre of the IRA, in Birmingham in the 1980s, with the Birmingham pub bombings in recent memory, and certainly, not extended family, but extended friends and colleagues who were involved in those, and had a massive effect on the city, and when you went to the library when I was a kid in the centre of Birmingham, you had to go for a metal detector, and that sort of stuff. And
Yes, people forget, don't they?
yeah,
Because I think one of the reasons that perhaps people our age and older get so angry about the things that come in, and people say, oh, it's really essential because of terrorism. And you think, well, we spent our 20s and 30s living with
mm,
terrorism, and yet these civil rights breaches weren't necessary. So, how can they be necessary now? But yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, living in East London, I think the last huge bomb around here was only about 96, and it
mm,
took out a massive part of the docks very, very close to where I live. So, yes, I mean, it was, I remember one winter where the Harrods bomb, my sister was working just up the road. She got blown down the street. My partner's brother was working in Harrods itself. He kind of got, these things really did touch us.
yeah.
And yet it's been so quickly forgotten.
It has, and it all went into the exhibition, and that kind of paranoia I had as a kid, the fact that the awareness, even though I was born in '71, so like I kind of grew up really at the height of that IRA mainland bombing campaign, was sort of my years when I was becoming cognizant of news and what was going on in the world around me. I grew up in a very political family anyway, so we were always very engaged with current affairs and politics and news. So I feel like that was a big part of it. Like, for example, there's a guy in the film. He's the leader of the political wing of Reasonable Adjustment, and they do this kind of they have to replace his voice with an actor's voice, and they did that all the time when I was a kid. Whenever Jerry Adams, Martin McGuinness were on TV, they'd have
Oh,
this
yes, I
plummy
remember that.
actor's voice, slightly camp, yeah, it was weird. That was going on up until the early '90s, actually. So it's utterly believable that so it took a bit of a cue from things like that. But we and I remember those shows, those World in Actions vividly, about the IRA and the ALF and rave culture. There's a great one about rave culture, World in Action. If anybody wants to laugh, go and watch that. It's brilliant, about the horrors of ecstasy and things like that. So it's about channeling that into something which is really convincing. So the documentary, we shot it on 16mm film, using a camera they would have had. Same crew. We used the same lights. We used tungsten lights they would have had at the time. Same sound recording devices. Everything was done how it would have been done in real detail to get it exactly right. You can see the hairs in the gate on the film flickering through, and we then did a sound mix, which was a mono sound mix. So it sounds very different to how sound recording and mixes sound now, and that took ages to get right. We invented this form of audio description called talk text, which in the mythos of the exhibition was discontinued in 1991.
If I can just say, Rosa Canosa has a question from previously, and I was waiting for an opportune moment. And she says, could you say a bit more about talk test for audio description?
Oh, yeah. So, Rosa, it was about, we knew we didn't want, I can't stand sort of access, which sort of, sometimes, it's there to do a job, right? But, I wanted it to be part of the exhibition and part of the vibe of the exhibition. So we invented this talk text thing, purportedly produced by Texas Instruments, who used to make the Speak and Spell, and I had this little toy thing, when I can't remember what it was called, like a little robot thing made by Texas Instruments when I was a kid. So I was like, yeah, okay, we're going to make up our own form of audio description. I think it's quite a good idea, actually. Sorry to any audio describers out there. But it sort of, and it works, but also the language, if you listen to the language of the AD in that, it's really offensive, but it would have been in the day, So it says, a cripple is sitting in a wheelchair, struggles up, and it was part of the
genius.
It's kind of creating that vibe that there's a hegemony, an able-bodied hegemony, which is looking down at these people, and this is what they're fighting against, and that the tone of the documentary was meant to be a little bit kind of paternal liberalism, I'd call it. These directors, we know people like Paul Greengrass has gone on to do big Hollywood films in 1993 and are very left-leaning, concerned about disability. And I kind of wanted to get that pitch because a lot of that World in Action documentary making had a kind of slightly left-wing bias, so that was the pitch of that. But then it's undermined by this, horrific, crass audio description. And there are little fun things, you can look out for in the different accessible formats. If you've got the time, you can really rifle through it because there's a lot of detail in there. And the microfiche, we wrote like reams of newspaper articles, and I think there are 5 on the website or something, but all these microfiche articles. And by duplicating, giving it that kind of veracity and filtering it through duplicated images, or like the microfiche, which probably anybody under 30 doesn't have a clue what microfiche is, but it's these tiny little microfilms of newspapers, which you could watch on a big reader, in the days before computer archives and stuff. And just it felt like it gave them more authenticity if we filtered them through some kind of medium, be it 16mm film, microfiche, an archaic form of audio description. It just gave it a bit more, so it wasn't just reasonable adjustment. We had to create this whole mythos around it, and this whole CFAX subtitles, he uses those now, but they were kind of great fun. Sorry, I'm waffling a bit, but I can't remember the question.
It's all absolutely fascinating stuff, but I do want to make sure that you've got at least time to have a drink. One of the things that we're very proud of in all of the festival work this year is that it's creating, people have more time, and maybe they don't want to look at something now, but maybe they want to have a look at it later. And everything that we create in the exhibition as we go along, like these films, then becomes part of it. So all of the festival, we say the events don't pass, they just expand. And when we have our annual 3-week closure over Christmas, there's going to be plenty to do for anybody who's used to coming to our events on a daily basis, because there's just so much there, and you could easily spend at least 2 days just going around your exhibition. So, and in another sense, I think online in this case is almost more immersive, because if I was in a gallery with other people, I wouldn't have that opportunity to engage with it. And I think if I was in the cinema, one of the things I always say when I'm teaching film is, the thing is, the screen dominates. When you dominate the screen, it is not the same as the screen dominating you. But
Yeah.
then you're not engaged in the same way because it's not interactive. I mean, I can absolutely see you could only have done this as fine art, but the level of detail, even understanding that they had the different cameras and things, I think if you hadn't got a filmmaking background, my guess is that most of us would have settled for shooting something on video in Final Cut Pro, running it through, shoving it into black and white, and putting some fake hairs on, but it wouldn't have had the same authenticity at all. It wouldn't have had the same quality, but I don't think many people would have had the skill to do what you've done.
Well, it was, I mean, it was really important to do that, I think. I just couldn't think of another way of doing it, really. We spent a vast amount of money, of unlimited money, doing it, but it was sort of worth it, because it kind of works. Yeah, and I know exactly what you mean. But I've been to a lot of exhibitions where I thought, I can see the top of the set there. I can, metaphorically, I know that it's not real. And and you look at something like, I was at the Biennale a few years ago, and it wasn't part of that actually, but I was in Venice and I went to the Damien Hirst exhibition, The Wreck of the Unbelievable, and there were just things in there. I felt like he pushed it a bit too far, and it doesn't quite work. And somebody like Jamie Shovelin, he's a great artist. He was my mentor on this, who's done a lot of this kind of thing. He made this show Hiker Meet, which where it features a film called Hiker Meet, which isn't a real horror film, and it's made up, and there's mythos around it and stuff like that. And what I liked about his work is I kind of believed it, because it was really well done. And I thought, if you're going to do this, you've got to do it properly. Otherwise, maybe it's being done too properly, because I was shocked when we had a talk about it at the art house, and there were like 40 people in the room, and we asked people to put their hands up. He thought it was real, and virtually everybody put their hands up. And the other people were people who were working on the exhibition or working for the gallery, so they knew anyway. And I kind of thought, oh God, maybe Tony Heaton was there, the artist, disabled artist. I'm sure a lot of people know him. And he said, why don't you give people envelopes as they leave the gallery, and it just says it's not real, and they open it up and they take the envelope away with them, and say, oh, it's not real. Okay. And then they start to think about it, because otherwise, what's the point in it not being real? If you've done something about Dan, and it would have been a lot easier.
We certainly haven't admitted till tonight that it's not real, but we leave everybody to make up their own minds. And of course, there are people who've gone through it and gone, well, I know that didn't happen, and people who think it did. And of course, I mean, you mentioned Tony Heaton, who's most recently been chair of Shape. I mean, I remember Tony was involved in some of the protests around the telethon got quite active, didn't they? And wasn't there a piece that I think Tony was involved with, where there was a sort of pyramid of collecting cans and people were throwing a prosthetic leg at it to knock it down?
Yeah, he brought that up to the discussion, actually. He scrapbook about that. I thought it was brilliant. But the telethon was great, and the piss on pity thing. Because there's a bit in the documentary where, this visually impaired guy who goes into Pebble Mill at 1 and starts shooting the place up with his AK-47, and that's another story, actually. We had to go to an armourer. So they have to be licensed by the Home Office. There's only about 10 of them in the UK. And we shot this TV camera in his firing range with live ammunition from an assault rifle, and it's in the film, the footage of it, and we shot it all from different angles and stuff. So we went to real degrees of of making it authentic. But that was an amplification of the telethon protests. That's what we wanted to do. So what happened if they went a bit further, and went a bit wilder with their actions?
Well, yes, and I think that's that's what really appeals to me about the whole thing. You know, it's a bit like Julie occupying the CIL and bringing Lambeth to a centre. You know, these things did happen, but they weren't documented by anybody but ourselves. They didn't make a great deal of news. They're not well remembered. The
Mm,
most Every time I see something about disability arts in the 20th century, let alone disability rights, it's like all the radical stuff seems to have been totally whitewashed out, and we are back to sort of people playing a guitar and singing a protest song.
mm.
You know, I just think it is so clever. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one listening to you that thinks I would happily read an entire book just about how you made this, with the documentation of how you really made it. How long did it take? I mean, can you tell us a bit more about the sort of length from when you first thought of it to the development and so on?
Yeah. Well, we started in March 20. Yeah, we started about sort of early 2019, and then I think March we started filming bits and pieces. Um, I think the first thing I did was burning the wheelchair, and that was quite difficult to do because you can't just burn a wheelchair in your back garden. You know, it's like got lots of toxic foam and stuff in it. So I had to take that to a film studio backlot, and we just poured it in diesel and poured diesel over it and set a light to it actually, and then watched it burn. And I've got lots of behind the scenes footage of that actually. But then I got a guy, really good photographer, I know, to do reportage style photographs on Ektachrome, black and white film, 35mm, take a series of photographs of it, and yeah, that would have been about March, April, and then the whole thing slowly came together. Writing the articles took ages, and not all the articles are on the website because I didn't like some of them, and some things got cut out as well of the film. And film probably, we shot the film. We had to go up to the Armourers in Yorkshire, so it took ages. We filmed some of it in Birmingham, some of it in London at the Houses of Parliament, different locations. And there was quite a lot we had to cut out just because it didn't get that degree of verisimilitude. There's a word I love, but it didn't have that realness. What we found is when we used actors, they didn't work so well. So it's better getting real people. Some actors can do that kind of realness really, really well, and others can't. So that took a while. So sometimes you go back and refilm something or re-edit something because it didn't quite work with the actor we had. We get a real person to do it instead. Same with the voiceovers. I had loads of voiceovers which weren't right, and ended up getting this guy who's a reporter for the Telegraph. He was absolutely perfect to do the voiceover on the World in Action thing. So there was a lot of toing and froing, and that took ages, but it was kind of we finding our way because I don't think anybody's ever really done anything like this before, and it was, and
No, I'm quite
authenticity
sure
was,
they haven't.
yeah, yeah. And so it took, and then finally, we were working right up until the last minute on hanging the exhibition. That was end of January this year. So yeah, it took about a year, and that was my main project for the year. I wasn't really, I did a short film, but I wasn't doing any feature films or anything like that. Directing television at that time. It was all focused on this, and I loved it. I think it's probably the most fun thing I've ever done. It's just been a real joy, and I feel it kind of works. Well, it works for me anyway, and that's sort of the most important thing, isn't it? It's kind of, I'm not sure how much anybody else gives a shit really, but it works for me, and the sort of people who are invested in disability rights, arts, culture, who are into this sort of thing, they've all got an opinion on it, whether they like it or not. So that's been interesting as well, engaging with those people.
I think one of the things that really comes out of that, which is really important to know as an artist, but I'm not sure funders always appreciate, is the level of experimentation and the level of time and I'm going to try it this way, but actually this actor hasn't worked. I'm going to try it this way, but
Yeah.
actually this voice doesn't work. So now I'm going to try it again. We had funding sessions earlier, and in some ways, I feel in some ways, the Arts Council are much more flexible. But in other ways, the project grant funding means that you say, in January, I'm going to do this, in February, I'm going to do that. There's no kind of movement that says, I'm going to try this, maybe I'll try it again, maybe I'll get to post production in January, maybe I'll do it in August. The BFI seems to be much more aware of the flexibility. But I do wonder whether the sort of the more traditional funding system, because you
Mm.
came through unlimited, stops people being able to experiment in those ways. Or indeed, unless you build it into the budget at the beginning, you go, well, I don't have a budget to go and try it with another actor. I'm just going to have to put up with it. And yet, like you say, if you hadn't had that meticulous detail, it couldn't have had the credibility and authenticity it's had.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, Unlimited work. It was interesting working with them because I think they're a bit. I think they're a bit uncertain of me at first, and because I didn't really done that much art before for proper funders and stuff. Just done it for myself, and they were a bit suspicious of that. So I had to do like an R&D phase, where I did some of the work, like I burnt the wheelchair and things like that, and I presented what I was going to do to them, and I'd made the logo by then. I mean, the logo was a real breakthrough because that was a real focus then. You asked about the photographs, actually. What I did do a photography project when I was at art school, and I used the real photographs, but I composited them and put the RAD logo onto them, and did things like that. And we spray painted a huge 10-foot RAD logo on the gallery wall as well, which was great fun. But it seemed like a focus. I thought, right, we've got a movement now. We've got an image and a logo. Extinction Rebellion being a classic one, we just thought that logo, the egg timer, is so powerful. It's absolutely brilliant. And if I could come up with something, that was a fraction as impactful as that, so we came up with this idea of a square in a round hole, and that's and I think it's kind of believable because there was a lot of graffiti going up at the time, that sort of time in the mid-90s, early 90s and stuff. So people cottoned onto it. I can imagine people running with it and it becoming a bit of a cult thing.
Yeah, I should ask you now, really, Justin, would you send me a copy of the logo and I'll add it to the event page when I put the recording up, because I think it would be nice for people to have it readily accessible, shall we say, to copy.
Yeah.
I just want to remind the audience, we just have another 8 minutes left. If you have a question you'd like to ask Justin or a point you'd like to make, do use the live chat. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Zoom, then you can use the Q&A box. What did you, did you have to make a spray stencil and everything in order to be able to, because you've got various scenarios, haven't you? And some I'm imagining that you've imposed the logo photo digitally onto a photograph, and some you've done for real.
Whenever you see it on the wall, it's always digital. So all the student photos are, and there's a couple of shots in the documentary, and they're digital as well, because we tried to spray it on walls for real with water-based paints, and it just looked crap. So we had to do that digitally, and so there was a lot. Yeah, there was a lot of, and all the photos are composite images. They're all with the wheelchairs burning and things like that. They're not real library photographs which have been doctored and stuff. So there's a huge amount of detail. One thing we haven't talked about, and I'm aware we're coming to the end, and I don't know if anybody else has got any questions, but and I wondered how you feel about this, Stu, as well, and the audience, because I have a concern that we've done this website, and it's been great doing it and getting it to work out more widely, and allowing people to see it. But then you have an issue, I feel, that disabled people become institutionalized digitally in the wake of COVID, in the same way that, you had sort of institutionalization of disabled people after the war years, and this kind of new awareness of disability because so many injured people coming back from the war, etc. And I just wondered if there's a danger that we do it again now, that people who have to self-isolate for longer, of which there are many in the disabled community, are going to be stuck at home, and the government says, okay, that's them, they're at home, we don't have to worry about them. And so the next exhibition I'm doing is all about getting people out there, actually, whatever happens with COVID. I mean, fingers crossed, God willing, we look like we've got this vaccine thing, which will change the world again, somewhat back to normal. But there's still going to be a lot of self-isolating, especially with this government and their track record at rolling out, mass health programs and protocols and what have you. So is there a danger that, in the next 12 months, you don't see wheelchair users in galleries, and then there becomes less and less provision, and it becomes a culture in the arts world, of thinking, do we not care? We have more Peterloo monuments,
I kind of feel like that's been my life for the last 20 years, though. I mean, I've been unable to go out for 20 years without support. And it took me 4 years for the local authority to recognise I even had a right to go out. So it took me 4 years to get my hour and a half social time a week. When I do get to a gallery, there's going to be a row about parking. The lift access is going to be like a coffin. The toilets aren't going to be accessible. What I have loved since 2012 is absolutely, having this regular thing where, all right, I'm going to a kind of not very nice pop up venue, but we will have our own building hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months. But being able to leave the house, go, oh, look, I can see people, I can see cars, I can see the park, and then ending up in a situation which was, yeah, is very sheltered. But again, without proper support for me, it would need to be. But just being able to get out. So, certainly, and I know there are people from Together watching this, I do really miss you all. We haven't left the house for 8.5 months now. We haven't had a visitor because there's no PPE even for the PAs. Our GP can't even come in to give us a flu vaccine because there's no decent PPE. And when you look at the fact that despite being this isolated, we've got the same death rates as care home residents, which I think is all about the fact that there's no PPE at all, but also the demands. If somebody wants me to return something, it's, well, why can't you come out and meet the delivery person? And I say, well, because there are people without masks shouting into their phones and at each other. They're less than 2 meters from my door. It doesn't matter what the delivery person does. But there's no awareness and no real caring. I think on International Day, it's really made me feel, what about all of us at home? We do seem to be invisible. But I remember Lawrence Clark, who, for anybody who doesn't know, is a very funny sit down comedian, saying in a show right back about 15 years ago, well, what care in the community is we create our own care homes, which are cheaper to run, and then we stay in them. So, if anything, for me, what I find the kind of digital revolution has done has suddenly provided more access. All of the people who've said to me they couldn't make a video call because I can't make voice calls, suddenly they can. All the
Mm,
meetings I was
mm,
told couldn't take place virtually, suddenly they can. If I go into a Zoom and I adjust my camera so nobody can see the wheelchair, oh my goodness, I haven't been spoken to with respect like that for more than a quarter of a century. It makes a huge difference. And I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but the theme for International Day is not all disability is visible. Well, actually, I would say no disability is actually visible, whether you use a medical model or a social model. But it's very interesting when you adjust a camera, how these things change. So I think it's got pluses and minuses. I mean, I'm certainly very concerned that my life could be, well, if we live in a country that accepts COVID is circulating in the community, then no vaccine is 100% effective. A cold knocks me out for 6 weeks. Life is going to be more limited. But also, even though the assistance dogs haven't been for a walk for 8.5 months, they're so much happier. And you just realize that kind of daily series of microaggressions you go through from the moment you set foot outside and the taxi driver goes, oh, I didn't know you'd got a wheelchair, or you can't have the dog, or it just, you sort of think, well, actually, maybe a virtual exhibition is just much less stressful. So I really want to protest my right to go out. I'd do that if there was blue badge parking at the protest and I could get a support worker. But in the meantime, I'm just really, really loving reasonable adjustment. And there's a message from Pamela to everybody which says, I love this. I've been fighting for disability rights all my life, and I'm always surprised how little we have achieved. The lack of interpretation on the news has left so many people in the dark about COVID. And yeah, absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, Pamela. We're going to have to leave it here because it's 8 o'clock. I'm going to come back to Justin in a minute for a final word, but I just want to thank again Global Real Time Captioning for the live captions, Chris Burrow for the British Sign Language interpretation, Arts Council England for funding the festival, National Lottery Community Fund for funding our clubs programme, and National Lottery Emergency Fund for providing all of the extra support we've got this time for, in particular, captioning, but also BSL interpretation. So yes, I'm going to hand over to you for a final word, Justin. I wanted to just say thank you so much again. It's been such a pleasure as well as a privilege to premiere this online exhibition with you. And yes, we just are going to enjoy it for a very long time to come.
Oh, thank you, Jill. And little to say apart from thanks to everybody for coming along and listening to me going on about something that is not really, doesn't exist, which is interesting. But I hope I've sort of explained and kind of helped to contextualize it. But for those of you who perhaps were not quite understood what I was getting at. Yeah, it's been a really interesting process. As always with this, I feel like it's a living and breathing thing, and talking about it is the most useful thing that we can do. Love it or loathe it, and it's an interesting thing to keep on talking about. It's going to be part of the Unlimited Festival at Southbank Centre, organised by Southbank Centre, which is another digital festival. They just announced the programme today. So I'm going to be doing a couple of talks there as well. So if you would like to come along and engage more with that and maybe go away and digest it or go away and have a look at the website, please do and come back in January. And I think we're doing a couple of artist sessions there, and there'll be more of a chance to interact. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. And there's comments from Jay and Celie, which I will just have to sum up as saying, thanks, many thanks. This has been great. And Celie finishes, thanks for all this sharing and for including it with the festival this year. So I'd just like to wish everybody a safe trip, whether you're going to the kitchen or onto your next Zoom. And the film festival continues tomorrow with events in the daytime for filmmakers, whatever stage you are in your career. And then tomorrow evening, our films open on YouTube and on the website with the programme Powerful Women. Thank you so much again, and good night.